Hello, and thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to do part 2 of our talk with William Federer. Today we're going to look at socialism, the real socialism history from Plato to present. I think you'll find it very interesting. So let's get started.
So this is my book on socialism. I'm going to give you a quick overview, and goes back to Plato, 380 BC, Athens. And he writes in passing of Atlantis, this highly civilized city on an island, very structured, very advanced, and it is sinks in the sea. Right now, it's legendary. There's no actual proof that it existed. Some thinks it was Santorini, which is an island that's all that's left is the rim of a volcano crater. And so the island could have blown up, could have caused a tsunami across the Mediterranean, but there's not a lot of archaeological proof. But nevertheless, Plato thought that Atlantis existed, and he considered it a highly structured society. And Plato considered democracy an unstructured society. And he said democracy, demos means people, krasi means rule. And in a democracy, the chief characteristic is tolerance. Everybody tolerates each other. It's wonderful, it's charming. And he says it's like a bazaar that you can buy anything, like a piece of embroidery in which the colors and figures are the manners of men. There will be the greatest variety of human natures. He says, such is democracy, a pleasing, lawless, various sort of government, a charming form of government, full of variety and disorder, dispensing all sorts of equality to equals and unequals alike. So where Atlantis was a structured society, Athens' democracy is unstructured democracy. And he says, the manner of life is that of Democrats, because he's describing a democracy. He says, every man does what is right in his own eyes. And he says, the father gets accustomed to descend to the level of his son to fear them, and the son having no shame or fear of his parents. The teacher fears and flatters his students, and the students despise their masters and tutors. Citizens vote to take money from the city treasury and spread the wealth around. And so it's a democracy. They vote to empty the treasury and spread it all around. And then the treasury's empty, so they vote to take the money from the rich people. Now there's no rich people left. And then there's a shortage, and they begin to bicker. Don't cut back on what I'm used to getting. And then he says that the leaders deprive the rich of their estates and distribute them amongst the people. And at the same time, taking care to reserve the larger part for themselves. Democracy's insatiable desire brings her to disillusion. And then Plato says it creeps into their morality. And the young man passes into freedom and libertinism and useless and unnecessary pleasures. There is no conceivable folly or crime, not accepting incest or any other unnatural union. He has parted company with all shame. So yes, that's what he's talking about, this casting off of moral restraint. So democracy, they tolerate each other. Then they tolerate people that are a little bit off. Then they tolerate people that are a lot off. So finally, they're tolerating crooks and crime and fraud and all kinds of immorality and sexual promiscuity, and nobody cares. Matter of fact, an interesting study was done by an Oxford anthropologist named J.D. Unwin. He wrote a book called Sex and Culture in 1934, and he studied 80 civilizations over 5,000 years, and he found out that sexual promiscuity always precedes the destruction of a civilization. He says that first the civilization, whether it's the Greeks or the Romans or the Egyptians or the Assyrians or whatever, he studied 80 different major civilizations. They go through a period of pain and poverty. So there's a war, there's a famine. And then they work hard and they work together and they become productive. And then they end up becoming protective. And then they become patriotic. And that's when they begin to grow and become expansionistic and creative and innovative. And finally, they become prosperous. And then they want to enjoy their prosperity and they become pleasure-focused. And then they become promiscuous and indulgent and undisciplined and lawless and weakened. And they get conquered by the next rising civilization. Sort of like an athlete. When he's young, he watches his diet, he exercises, he's focused, and he's working out. And finally, he wins the championship. And he rules for a couple times, right? And then he starts getting a little bit lazy. And then he starts eating and he doesn't exercise much. It turns into a couch potato. In his mind, he still thinks he's the tough guy. But in reality, he's sort of flabby, and then he gets in the ring and gets the tar knocked out of him by the next up-and-coming athlete. Anyway, so John Adams writes to Jefferson, have you ever found in history one single example of a nation thoroughly corrupted that was afterwards restored to virtue? And without virtue, there can be no political liberty? Will you tell me how to prevent luxury from producing effeminacy? Intoxication, extravagance, vice, folly, no effort in favor of virtue is lost. Harry S. Truman said, without a firm moral foundation, freedom degenerates quickly into selfishness and anarchy. So Plato, he says that they tolerate each other, it's great. Then they tolerate people that are a little bit off, till finally they tolerate people that are a lot off, till finally they're tolerating crooks and crime and fraud and broad daylight looting and all kinds of immorality. And out of this chaos, the people begin to look for someone to come along and fix this mess. Right? It becomes an unstructured mess, and they said, we need somebody to fix it. And along comes a governor that says, I can fix it. I just need some emergency powers. And they end up turning into a tyrant. So Plato says that last of all comes the tyrant. When he first appears above ground, he's a protector. He's full of smiles. And then he begins to consolidate power. And if any are suspected of resistance to his authority, he will have a good pretense for destroying them. The protector standing up in the chariot of state with the reins in his hand, a tyrant absolute. So he starts off saying, hey, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to take care of you and everything. But before you know it, he's a tyrant. And what happens next? Having a mob entirely at his disposal, he's not restrained from shedding of blood. Could you imagine a governor encouraging the mobs? Yeah, go out there and exercise your First Amendment rights. And Plato says that democracy is doomed to fail, this unstructured mess, because it's based on people having virtue. And people really don't have virtue. He said if you give them a choice of giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. And now I'll mention in a little bit ancient Israel, and their experiment of self-rule lasted a little longer because they had a big magnet in the sky called God, who was drawing you to be virtuous because you were accountable to him. Athens did not have that. By Plato's time, Athens had a bunch of fickle deities that nobody believed in anyway. And so it was just being virtuous as long as it was the in thing to be virtuous. But Plato says if you give them a choice between giving up their life or giving up their virtue, they'll always give up their virtue to save their life. He actually said, if a truly just man lived, let him die as he lived. I might add that the just man will be scourged, racked, bound, and will at last be crucified. Here's Plato, 380 years before Christ, saying people really don't have virtue. If somebody with virtue was ever born, the world would crucify him. Imagine that. So Plato concluded that the best you can hope for is a nice tyrant, and he will bring a structured society. He's the philosopher king. So he has a tyrant is the head of gold. And his military and administrators are the arms and chest of silver. They make up the ruling class. And everyone else is the abdomen of iron and bronze, and they are in the ruled class. So socialism is a structured society with a ruling class and a ruled class. Now, the ruling class, they're above the law. They're politically connected. They're supported by the commoners below. The ruling class can do things like get their hair styled when nobody else can. Now, the ruled class, they own no property. They have no families. The government decides who gets to have children, and the government takes the children away from the parents, and the children are socialized in government schools, which is a term to get them to give up their parents' views and simply learn how to obey and serve the state. Plato explains that this tyrant will institute a structured society, right? Atlantis is structured, democracy is unstructured, but then unstructured is going to turn into chaos. People are going to want somebody to fix it, and it's going to turn back to this tyrant king, and he's going to set up a structured society. He says when the true philosopher kings are born in a state, they will set in order their own city. They will take possession of the children who will be unaffected by the habits of the parents. These they will train in their own habits and laws. And the children are taught noble lies. He actually says that you're going to teach the kids lies. He says, We want one single grand lie which will be believed by everybody. So, Plato's Atlantis, the structured society on this island, inspired 2,000 years later a guy named Sir Thomas More, who wrote The Island of Utopia in 1516. Now, 1516, this is just after 20 years after Columbus discovers America. And there's new lands discovered, and so some of these writers in Europe think, hey, what would it be like getting a chance to set up a new society on these new lands? And so the word utopia means nowhere. And he writes this, it's a fictitious island that Amerigo Vespucci discovered off the coast of South America. And the island of Utopia is written as a dialogue, which is the way the Greek classics are written, where it's a discussion with somebody. And the somebody is a traveler named Hythlodaeus, which means peddler of nonsense. And so this island of Utopia is a perfectly structured society. It has an upper class rulers, lower class commoners, and there's free health care. There's free identical clothing. Everyone receives free welfare. There are common meals in a monastic communal dining hall. Everyone lives in identical 3-story public housing. There are no locks on any doors. There is no private property. All goods are stored in a communal warehouse. There are no taverns, no alehouses, no coffee houses, no places for private meetings, no privacy. Everyone is tracked everywhere they go. And if you're caught without your internal passport, it's a lifetime of slavery. The government decides everyone's careers that you will work your entire life. There are no families. The government, again, decides who gets to have kids. They regulate childbearing, similar to China's one-child policy or Planned Parenthood. Margaret Sanger, she said, no woman shall have a legal right to bear a child without a permit. This is utopia. This is this perfectly socialist society, right? Everything's structured. Everybody's needs are taken care of. There's no private property. Everything's communal. Right, okay. Well, Plato's structured society on the island of Atlantis, Sir Thomas More's structured society. By the way, Sir Thomas More wrote it as a veiled jab at King Henry VIII, who is the one that switched from Catholic to Protestant. And he says, okay, everybody, you got to follow me along and you got to give up all your views. And sure enough, Henry VIII had Sir Thomas More killed. So Plato's Atlantis, Sir Thomas More's Utopia inspired Sir Francis Bacon, who wrote The New Atlantis. So he's directly referring back to Plato's Atlantis. And Sir Francis Bacon lived at the time of Shakespeare and Queen Elizabeth and Francis Bacon and all this, and the Pilgrims. So the New Atlantis, this is an island discovered in the South Pacific. And again, it's highly structured with a ruling class and a ruled class, and a little more scientific, because by this time the scientific revolution took place, and so their careers, the government decides, for everybody. Someone wrote a satire on this, Jonathan Swift's Gulliver's Travels. Right? Gulliver is washed up on an island. It's a highly structured society with this ridiculous ruling class. And then everybody else is the peasants in the ruled class, and their careers are all decided upon and so forth. Now, why is this important? The Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were originally a company colony. Companies were sort of a new thing. In the Middle Ages, there were no companies. It was a sin of usury to pay or receive interest. And so in the Middle Ages, if you wanted to do something big, like sail around the world looking for spices, you had to hit up some rich guy or a king. Well, the Reformation happens, and the Dutch start the first companies, the Dutch East India Company, where anybody could invest in a boat going to the Molucca Spice Island, and when it came back filled full of nutmeg, you'd get paid a profit. But if you wanted to sell your interest in the boat, you would go down to the Amsterdam Stock Exchange, which they invented. And if the boat was attacked by Muslim pirates or sank, that's when the Dutch invented insurance companies. Well, the British had the British East India Company, and then the Virginia Company, and then the London Company that had the Massachusetts colony. So the Pilgrims were a company colony, and a bunch of rich guys pitched in to pay for their boat ride and expected to get some money back out of their investment. And the company bylaws were written by these investors. They looked to Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon, and lo and behold, the Pilgrim bylaw said everything was owned in common. And the Pilgrims tried it and almost starved to death. The bylaws said all profits, benefits that are got by trade, traffic, trucking, working, fishing, or by any other means shall remain in ye common stock. And all are to have their meat, drink, apparel, and all their provision out of ye common stock. Pilgrim Governor Bradford said the failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients applauded by some of latter times. The Pilgrims knew they were trying to live out Plato's utopian, Plato's Atlantis and Sir Thomas More's Utopian, and it failed. And so this is William Bradford, that the taking away of private property and the possession of it in community would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. For in this instance, community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong man or the resourceful man had no more share of food, clothes, etc. than the weak man who was not able to do a quarter the other could. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc. with the humbler and younger ones thought it some indignity and disrespect. As for men's wives who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing their clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery, and many husbands would not brook it or allow it. Let none argue that this was due to human failing, rather than to this communistic plan of life in itself. I answer that God in his wisdom saw that another plan of life was fitter for them. So they began to consider how to raise more corn and obtain a better crop than they had done, so they might not continue to endure the misery of want, like starving through winter. At length, after much debate, the governor, with the chief among them, allowed each man to plant corn for his own household. Wow, what a novel idea. So every family was assigned a parcel of land. This was very successful. It made all hands very industrious, so that much more corn was planted than otherwise would have been by any means, and gave far better satisfaction. The women now went willingly into the field and took their little ones with them to plant corn, while before they would allege weakness and inability, and to have compelled them would have been thought great oppression. So we got Plato, Sir Thomas More, Sir Francis Bacon. It's all theoretical. These guys sitting around with their pen and paper and just imagining stuff. The Pilgrims try to live it out and almost starve to death. They scrap it. They give everybody their own plot of land. Now it's more successful, and they all survive. People say, well, didn't the early church own everything in common? Well, there's two very important differences: voluntary versus involuntary, and church versus government. So the early church, they voluntarily sold their property, and they laid the money at the feet of the apostles for the church to spread around. They did not have their land involuntarily taken away and then be forced to put the money at the feet of Pilate for the Roman government to spread around. If you want to voluntarily sell your land and voluntarily give the money to the church, fine, go ahead. Nobody's forcing you. You can do it. That's something called charity. When the government involuntarily takes it away from you and gives it away, it's not charity for you. It wasn't voluntary. And whenever the government gives anything, it's in exchange for votes. It's an exchange for those in power to stay in power. What's the example? Well, in Egypt, people were getting welfare from the government in exchange, but they get a bag of grain in exchange for their lives. We'll give you the bag of grain, but it's in exchange for your land, your cattle, your children, your lives. Whenever the church helps anybody, the church wants that person to become successful so they can help the next person that comes along, and it's a replication of helping people, letting them know that God loves them. So does that make it clear? Right? So when they say, oh, the early church owned everything in common, voluntary versus involuntary, and they did it through the church, not through the government. See, there's a confusion as to the role of government. God gives commands to 5 major groups: individuals, families, business, church, and government. There are commands for individuals to take care of the poor, to visit the sick, to go to the prisons, to help people. There's really no commands for the family to take care of poor strangers. The commands to the family are husbands, love your wives, and children, submit to your parents. There's really no commands for employers or employees to take care of the poor. Those commands are do an honest day's work, and employers don't hold back the wages. There are commands for the church to take care of the poor, and historically, the church has. The church has started orphanages and medical clinics and fed the orphans and fed the widows. And I wrote a whole thing on the history of hospitals. It was the church that invented hospitals. Did you know there's no command for the government to take care of the poor? The command to the government is the shortest. Protect the innocent, punish the guilty. There's no command for the government to be involved in healthcare. There's no command for the government to be involved in education. What's happened is the government has usurped the church's role. There's a great quote from Calvin Coolidge. He says, "It does not follow that just because something ought to be done, that the national government ought to do it." Oh, we need to take care of the poor. Yes, the church and the individuals, not the government. Well, we need health care. We need to have health care. Yeah, the individuals in the church, not the government. Why? Because whenever the government does anything, all the programs are administered by people who want to keep their jobs. And the temptation is for them to be discretionary and funnel those benefits to those that can help them keep in office and keep their jobs, and to regulate and take away from those that are threatening to want to cut the size of government and challenge their job. A great quote from Gerald Ford. People say, "Why don't you expand that program and spend more federal money?" I look them in the eye and say, do you realize that a government big enough to give us everything we want is a government big enough to take from us everything we have? So the Pilgrims, they replaced their company with something called covenant. What's a covenant? It's people caring for each other voluntarily. Why? Because they're individually accountable to God, and they get their rights from God, right? So it's people in agreement with each other, but more than just agreement, it's a commitment to each other, and you get your rights from God and you're accountable to God. The Pilgrims were really into, matter of fact, the Reformation's in 1517, the Age of Enlightenment starts in the early 1600s. You have a whole century where the scholars in Europe are not just thrilled that they can read the Bible in their own language. They study the first 400-year period when Israel comes out of Egypt before they get King Saul. This 400-year period is called the Hebrew Republic. And it's the most unique period in world history that you do not appreciate until you read all the rest of world history. And so I wrote several books. One of them is called Who is the King in America? And I go through how you have Nimrods and Pharaohs and Caesars and Kaisers and Sultans and Czars and Emperors and Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, Julius Caesar. The most common form of government in world history is kings. And it's that same fallen nature of a bully on a playground, or a diva of a junior high girls clique, right? Or a gang leader in the inner city, or an Indian chief in the country, that power wants to gravitate into the hands of one person. People say history repeats itself. Yeah, but each time it comes around, it's a little bit worse because with military advancements, the gang leader can kill more people. And so it keeps growing, and clearly there's a global goal in mind. But around 1400 BC, Israel comes out of Egypt, and for 400 years, they do not have a king. It's ruled by every single person being taught the law, and every person accountable to God to follow the law. So they were so into it that they taught Hebrew at Yale and Harvard. They even gave their commencement address in Hebrew. And this is the Yale coat of arms. To this day, they still have Hebrew characters on it. So if you think of it as a spectrum of power, one side's total government, the other side's no government. Total government, you get a king, a Pharaoh, a Caesar. He rules through fear. You do what the king says or he kills you. Montesquieu said, the motivating spring or force for a dictator is fear. That's the energy that goes through that makes everybody line up. But the other side of it is no government. So total government on one side, no government on the other. No government would be anarchy. No government unless each person is taught the law. I tried to find a way of explaining this. It's like everybody has an iPhone or one of those phones that has GPS. Instead of a GPS app, imagine if they had a behavioral app, right? In real time. So instead of saying, turn left 50 yards ahead, it would say, don't steal that off the table. I see you looking at it. Don't lose your temper at that person, right? Be nice here. Don't lie here, you know. And so everybody, and the Levites were the computer geeks that help you to download the app, right? Line upon line, precept, go to Apple Store, Google Play, right, whatever it is. You press this button here. And so everybody has a copy, an app, a law memorized in their heart. And so the big question is, why would you follow it? What would motivate you to follow an internal moral? Ancient Israel had the key ingredient. There's a God who is watching everyone. He wants you to be fair, and he's going to hold you accountable in the future. So you're about to steal something, nobody's around, you know you can get away with it, and then you think, God is watching me. He wants me to be fair. He's going to hold me accountable. Maybe I should hesitate stealing. So it creates something in your head called a conscience, right? So, covenant form of government. You're caring for each other. Why? Because we're all accountable to God. Now, God knew that the children of Israel would break the law, and rather than them walking around for the rest of their lives with a guilty conscience, once a year they had the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, where they offered the sacrifice to forgive everybody's sins in the whole country so they could start off the next year with a clean slate. Ronald Reagan, of course, that's foreshadowing Jesus. Ronald Reagan said, without God, there's no virtue because there's no prompting of the conscience. If there's no God, then laws are just something that some old men made up somewhere. Why follow them? Some will, as long as it's the in thing to be virtuous, like Plato said. But others are going to say, if there's no God, there's no afterlife, this life is all there is, have at it. And they're going to yield to their selfish side, and it's going to turn into lawlessness and chaos and robbing and stealing and smashing windows and walking out of stores with big screen TVs. And it's going to, out of this chaos, people are going to say, we need someone to come along and restore order. And in Israel's case, they went through this. So here you got the high priest, Eli. He's the main guy that's supposed to be teaching the law. His own sons are sleeping with women in the very tent where the Ark of the Covenant is. And then another Levite with a silver graven image. And you're like, isn't that one of the commandments? You're not supposed to have those. And then another Levite with a concubine. The law says the Levite's to marry a virgin of his own tribe. Here he is with a woman he's not even married to. He's not following the law. They're traveling. They're in a house surrounded by sodomites who bang on the door and rape the poor girl to death. Something about that behavior that appears at the last stages of a people ruling themselves, right? Plato talked about the young man gives into libertinism and useless and unnecessary pleasures, even incest and unnatural union. But here we have ancient Israel, right? They're not content to do it on their own. They want to force it on this Levite and this girl. And so the girl dies. And finally you read this line, every man did that which was right in their own eyes. Didn't we read that? Plato talked about the manner of life. Is that a Democrat? Everyone does what's right in their own eyes. And so what happens is Israel turned into an unstructured mess. And as long as they were following the law, there was some structure. When they got rid of that, it turned into an unstructured mess. And then they all said, we need someone to come along and fix it. And that's when they get King Saul. And Samuel cries, and the Lord tells Samuel, they have not rejected thee, but they have rejected me, that I should not reign over them. Right? So democracy without morals and virtue ends in chaos, out of which a tyrant usurps power. And so they got a tyrant named Saul. And one day Saul was pouting that his son Jonathan became friends with David, and he turns to his soldiers and he goes, none of you soldiers care about me. And the one soldier, Doeg the Edomite, said, King, I care. I saw David go to this town, and the priests there gave him some bread, and they gave him the sword of Goliath. Saul says, bring those priests to me. They come. He turns to his soldiers, says, kill them. The soldiers hesitate. Doeg the Edomite goes out there and kills them all. What just happened? The soldiers had been operating under the old system where every person is individually accountable to God to follow the law. The law says you need 2 or more witnesses before you condemn someone to death. There's only one witness, Doeg. And so these soldiers are saying, you're telling me to kill. I'm personally accountable to God. The law says you need 2 witnesses. There's only one, and this does not compute. They hesitate. They still have a conscience. Doeg says, King, I'm going to surrender my conscience to you. You tell me to kill, I'll kill. You tell me to kill the baby in the womb, I'll kill it. You tell me there's no more male and female, fine. You tell me sex is fluid and go to any bathroom you want. You tell me, well, what's next? Whatever you tell me, government, I'm going to surrender all of my views and my values, and I'm just going to surrender to the government. You tell me when to have church and tell me when not to have church. You tell me where to, I'll just do whatever you tell me. Anyway, so I just thought I'd come and give you a little encouragement tonight. Well, now how much time do I have? Do I have a little more time? So let's talk about the French Revolution. France helped us get independent. You know what they got in return for helping us? Nothing but debt, lots of it. Then they had a couple years where their crops failed. And the people said, you know what, if we can just chop off the king's head and his wife, Queen Marie Antoinette, all of our problems will be solved. So they chop off the head of the king and queen. It doesn't get any better. So then they chop off the heads of all the royalty. It doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the wealthy. You have money, we don't. You're selfish. Doesn't get any better. Then they chop off the heads of the businessmen and farmers. You got food and supplies, we don't. You're selfish. And then they chop off the heads of the hoarders, the people that have extra food. You got extra. I don't have enough. You're selfish. Then they chop off the heads of the clergy because they're speaking out against all the head chopping off stuff. And then they chop off the heads of the former revolutionaries, the ones that used to chop off heads but got tired of it. Somehow they're to blame. So they did a purge. And so 30,000 people had their heads chopped off in Paris, France. And so the motto of the French Revolution was liberté, égalité, fraternité, which is liberty, equality, fraternity. Fraternity is the French word for socialism. It's the collective, it's the group, the fraternity, the socialist state. Equality can be understood two ways. In America, it was equal treatment before the law, equal opportunity. In France, it was everyone having an equal amount of stuff. And if the fraternité, the group, thinks you have too much stuff and you're selfish, they can take away your stuff and kill you. And so while this is going on in America, the Yale president, Timothy Dwight, gives a sermon, and he says, about the year 1728, Voltaire, so celebrated for his wit and his hatred of Christianity, formed a systematical design to destroy Christianity and to introduce in its stead a general diffusion of irreligion and atheism. Again, democracy without morals and virtue ends in chaos, so he's getting rid of the morals and virtue. The being of God was denied and ridiculed. Possession of property was pronounced robbery. Right? You got property, you're selfish. Chastity, natural affection were declared to be nothing more than groundless prejudices. Right? The young man gives in to libertinism and useless and unnecessary pleasures, and Eli's son sleeping with women in the tent, and adultery, assassination, poisoning, and other crimes of like infernal nature were taught as lawful, provided the end was good. The education of youth, books replete with irreligion, infidelity and immorality, obscenity. So we're back to teaching the kids, right? Plato says the philosopher king will take the kids away from the family and bring them into the city and indoctrinate them with noble lies. And to destroy us, therefore, our enemies must first destroy our Sabbath and seduce us from the house of God, or pass laws keeping you from the house of God. So the French Revolution also destroyed their history. What's that? It's a process called deconstruction, where you separate people from their past, get them into a neutral where they do not remember where they came from, and then you brainwash them into the future you have planned for them. It's a sales technique. If I was a toothpaste salesman, the first thing I do is I tell you a bunch of negative things about the toothpaste you are currently using. You're still brushing with that old stuff? Haven't you heard it'll eat the enamel off your teeth? You're like, ooh, really? You're repulsed by it. Now I got you into a neutral. You're open-minded. What are all the toothpastes out there? Then I give you my pitch for this brand new tartar control enamel strengthening stuff. So that's what they do. They go into the classrooms and they tell the kids negative things about the founding fathers. They took land from India and sold people into slavery. They were chauvinists. Ooh, the students are repulsed by them. Now you got the kids into a neutral. They're open-minded. What are all the belief systems out there? Then you give them your pitch for socialism or LGBT or Islam. It's a drive neutral reverse. It's sort of like a gene replacement therapy for a culture. Take out the old DNA and you put in the new. And Europe went through this. It went from a Judeo-Christian Europe with Catholic cathedrals, Protestant Reformation, and Jewish neighborhoods, to a secular Europe with the French Revolution and Robespierre putting a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral and it's free sex, anything goes. And now it's turning into a Sharia socialist Europe, with Muhammad being the number one name for newborns and the government deciding everyone's careers. Carl Sandburg, a poet, said, when a nation goes down, one condition may always be found: they forgot where they came from. Now in America and in Western civilization, we have a Judeo-Christian history that's being erased. But did you know that the emperor in China did the same thing? 3rd century BC was the warring states period, where a half dozen Chinese kingdoms fought, and one guy won, Qin Shi Huangdi, and he's the one considered the founder of the Han Dynasty. And he was criticized for doing things differently than they had been done before. So he decided to destroy before. He ordered all the books of history burnt. And they had these bamboo annal books because they'd write on strips of bamboo, just top to bottom, and they would weave them all together. And anyway, his Chancellor, Li Si, 213 BC, wrote, "I, your servant, propose that all historians' records other than those of Quins be burned. If anyone under heaven has copies of the classics of history, Shu Jin, they shall deliver them to the governor for burning. Anyone who dares discuss the classics of history shall be publicly executed. Anyone who uses history to criticize the present shall have his family executed. Anyone who has failed to burn the books after 30 days of this announcement shall be sent to build the Great Wall." And did you know that in 1960, Mao Zedong did the same thing? It's called the Cultural Revolution. And he was a socialist communist, so he destroyed the oldest Buddhist temple in China. He destroyed the great gates of Beijing, these ancient gates. And so he trashed this history. And why? Because he wanted to get rid of the history so that the young people didn't know where they came from, and he could brainwash them into the People's Republic of China. Matter of fact, it's still going on. I saw this article yesterday. It says Xi Jinping ordering erasure of Genghis Khan from Chinese history. So they're going through in the Inner Mongolia, destroying these, the cities have these carved stones that give the history of Genghis Khan. They're like destroying them and deface them. Well, Pol Pot did the same thing in Cambodia. And so he brought in his communist Khmer Rouge, and he killed 25% of his country. He killed anybody that wore glasses. He said if you wore glasses, you could read. If you read, you knew the history. And he made 1975 the New Year's zero and said anything prior to that was irrelevant, right? And Islam does the same thing. And so when the Muslims came into Alexandria, Egypt, the story is that they burnt all the books in the Library of Alexandria, the oldest library in the world, and they kept it up. Muhammad said, do not leave an image without obliterating it, and a high grave without leveling it. So here, this is the museum in Assyria that had stuff from 700 BC. Remember, Jonah and the whale and Nineveh. And here they are smashing these. But in America, we have a Judeo-Christian heritage. And so we have a 1619 project, which destroys history and rewrites it. And a socialist, Howard Zinn's People History of the United States, which says everybody that came before is evil, 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 and you're bad, bad, bad. And the French Revolution did this. So they tore down the statue of good King Henry IV, who tried to patch up the Protestants and Catholics. And then they tried to erase Christian heritage from the country. They destroyed religious monuments. Graves were desecrated. St. Genevieve, the young woman who got Paris to fast and pray when Attila the Hun was scourging Europe in the 5th century. She's considered the patron saint of Paris. During the French Revolution, they dug up her bones and trashed them. Religious meetings were prohibited. Churches were closed. Christian schools were banned. Church education was outlawed. No private public worship allowed. Crosses were forbidden. They killed entire orders of nuns. I mean, you read the story, the nuns were singing their church song as they were standing in line to get their head lopped off, one by one. And of course, each one, there'd be one less singer to find there was just one lone nun singing, and they chopped her head off. And ministers and priests and those who harbored them were executed on sight. A very similar thing happened in Mexico in 1917 with President Calles, killing the church leaders. And then there was a rural area called the Vendée. And they thought they're safe because they're hundreds of miles from Paris. Well, guess what? They send their army out there and they kill 300,000 men, women, and children in the Vendée, considered the first modern genocide. This set the model for all socialist revolutions, where you kill off the old order. Tear down, kill off, so that you can set up your new liberté, equalité, fraternité. Robespierre put a prostitute in Notre Dame Cathedral, covered her with a sheet, and said, "This is the goddess of reason, let's worship her." They didn't want done in the year of the Lord, so they made 1792 the new year one. They didn't want a 10-day week. A 7-day week, because it went to the Bible, so they came up with a 10-day week called the decade week. Each day had 10 hours, each hour had 100 minutes, each minute had 100 seconds. They said 10 was the number of man, because you count on 10 fingers, so they made every measurement in France divisible by 10. They called it the metric system. Maybe that's why I never really liked the metric system. So since they got rid of God, there's no right, there's no wrong. Who decides right and wrong? The state, the mob. And so democracy without morals and virtue ends in this chaos and this killing and confusion. And out of that comes a tyrant named Napoleon. And so out of that unstructured mess, he seizes power, he crowns himself emperor, and he goes across Europe, and 6 million people die in the Napoleonic Wars. And anyway, after he conquers Europe, and then he's finally banished to the island of St. Helena, the king of Prussia said, we can't get conquered that easy again. We need to strengthen the state. So we got a philosopher named Hegel. And I'll tell you about him in a moment. But let's go through this real quick. We go from the Pilgrims and Puritans, and they copied the Israel model of a covenant with a personal God you're accountable to. And the next century after the Pilgrims was called the Age of Enlightenment, and covenant turned into social contract with an impersonal God. This comes from the scientific revolution, when Sir Isaac Newton discovers there's laws of planetary motion, laws of gravity, laws of optics, and some theologian says, well, maybe God made everything with laws, and like a guy winds up a clock and the gears all turn, God made everything, but he's sort of standing back and it's all just running on its own. So if God is there, he's distant, he's not involved, he's impersonal. And in the century after that, it turns into social contract with no God with the French Revolution. And it's just get your rights from the group, you're accountable to the group. And the next century it turned into Marxism and socialism, where the state is God. You get your rights from the state, you're accountable to the state. And if the state doesn't think you're worthwhile, the state can kill you. Here's Hegel, who was in Germany, taught at the University of Berlin. He says, the state is God walking on earth. We must worship the state. All the worth which the human being possesses, he possesses only through the state, right? And they wanted to strengthen their state so they wouldn't get conquered by another Napoleon. And Rousseau, who wrote The Social Contract, says, when the state says to a citizen, it is expedient for the state that you should die, he ought to die, because his life is a gift made conditionally by the state. Well, 100 years later in Germany, you got the New York Times reporting, Nazi Ministry of Justice authorized physicians to end the sufferings of incurable patients. No life still valuable to the state will be wantonly destroyed. And then, of course, you got Pol Pot, to keep you is no benefit, to destroy you is no loss. So your life is only of worth if you benefit the state. So we go Pilgrim covenant under God, Age of Enlightenment, social contract with a distant God, French Revolution, social contract with no God, to socialism where the state is God. Hegel said the state recognizes no authority but its own. It acknowledges no abstract rules of good and bad. What's an abstract? You mean like the 10 Commandments? Yeah, there's no rule. It is just a power grab by the state. And if you help the state grab more power, the deep state, then the deep state thinks your life is valuable to them. But if you challenge them, they think your life is no longer valuable and they'll get rid of you. Eisenhower put it this way, in many lands, the state claims to be the author of human rights. If the state gives rights, it can and inevitably will take away those rights. The founding fathers had to refer to the Creator in order to make the revolutionary experiment make sense. He said, all men, it was because all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights that men could dare to be free. So our founders had to refer to the Creator. So do your rights come from government or from a source higher than the government? Our founders said the rights come from God. Government's job is to protect our God-given rights. If there is no God, your rights come from the government, and what the government giveth, the government can taketh awayeth. Now, I talked about how democracy without morals and virtue turns into chaos, out of which a tyrant arises. There's some philosophers that say, well, let's speed it along by intentionally creating crisis. And don't have time to go through it all. There's Abimelech tried to do that and stir up the people of Shechem to make himself king. And then we got Machiavelli, lived in Italy, and Italy was a bunch of city-states that fought, and he thought if one prince could control all of Italy, it would stop the infighting. So he writes a book called The Prince, where he says the ends justifies the means. So if a prince conquers a city in his quest to unify Italy, so they'll stop the infighting, he thinks that's a good thing. So if a prince conquers a city, the people don't want to be conquered, they would hate the prince. But if the prince pays criminals, agitators, rioters, and they smash windows and set buildings on fire, the people will panic and feel insecure. And out of this chaos, they'll want somebody to come along and fix this mess. And that's when the prince can usurp power and make himself in charge. And so it's called Machiavellianism, where you create or capitalize on a crisis to consolidate control. It's really good marketing. You go around the back of the house and set it on fire, and then you go around the front of the house and sell them a fire extinguisher. And they'll pay anything for it and even thank you for being there. right? So more recently, it's worded this way. You never want a serious crisis to go to waste. It is an opportunity to do those things that you thought could not be done, but do before. Or Hillary Clinton says, the chief of staff for President Obama is an old friend of mine and my husband's. He said, never waste a good crisis. So when you and I see a crisis, our response is, how can we help people through it? When ambitious politicians see a crisis, their response is, how can we use this to usurp power? So democracy without morals and virtue turns into chaos. Out of that chaos, they want to usurp power. And Hegel said, how do you take power away from people and concentrate it in the hands of the state? He came up with Hegelian dialectics. It's a triangle. One corner is a thesis, the opposite is an antithesis, and the top corner is a synthesis, right? Sounds complicated, but it's not. In other words, you start off with a status quo, you create a problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And then you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. Then you create another problem that's real bad, and everybody's happy to settle for your answer that's half as bad. And after every crisis, people give up a little more of their freedom into the hands of the state. And guess who was a student at the University of Berlin under Hegel? But Karl Marx. He was a member of the young Hegelians. And so Marx says, how do you create a problem that's real bad? An antithesis. You send in agitators, agent provocateurs, community organizers, labor organizers. Their job is to find people with grievances, stir them up to riot. And when the country gets destabilized enough, they panic. And then you have an opportunity for a dictator to usurp power. And so they'd organize the proletariat against the bourgeois, poor against the rich, blacks against the whites, Catholics against the Protestants, so on and so forth. And I go through how Eugene Debs brought this to America, and he organized strikes where they destroyed $80 million worth of railroad cars in 1890s. And then he started the Socialist Party of the United States, and he ran for president 5 times, 1 time from prison. And then out of the Socialist Party branches the Communist Party USA. Lenin said socialism is a transition phase to communism. And so these Communist Party USA is running candidates. But then when Franklin Roosevelt makes a treaty with the Soviet Union during World War II, the Communist Party USA says, why should we be running another candidate when the Democrat Party is making treaties with the Soviet Union? So from 1940 on, the Democrat Party has just supported, the Communist Party has just supported Democrat candidates. And so I'm going through this as fast as I can. 1920s Germany was a republic, right? The people ruled themselves. But then somebody started a party called the National Socialist Workers' Party. It was called Nazi, right? The National Arbeiter, which means worker, Sozialistisches Party. And the head of it was Hitler. And he had a violent group that would create crisis. It was called the Brown Shirts, sort of an BLM Antifa type. And these brown shirts would march into the meetings. They were called stormtroopers, Sturmabteilung, stormtroopers. They would march into the meetings of Hitler's opponents and shout down the speakers, disrupt the meeting. And then they would lock arms and block access to buildings and block streets. Could you imagine people locking arms and blocking streets? And then they went into the cities and they smashed windows and set on fire and looted over 7,000 Jewish stores in the night of broken glass. Then their capital got set on fire. And in this confusion, Hitler seizes power and has his political opponents shot without a trial. And the dust settles. Germany's no longer a republic, it's a dictatorship. So republics and democracies without morals and virtue, and you got these people stirring up chaos. Out of that chaos, they have somebody seize power. And then Hitler turns around and kills the violent brown shirts because he doesn't need them anymore. After World War II, Germany, France, England give independence to their former colonies. And these former colonies turn into brand new countries with brand new leaders. It's a nice world, except the Soviet Union decides to export communism. So they send KGB agents into these countries. And they find people with grievances, ethnic grievances, racial grievances, economic grievances, religious grievances, Sunni, Shia, Orthodox, and they stir them up. They break them into groups of victims and oppressors, haves and have-nots. And then they would orchestrate protests, that they would escalate into riots, that they would smash windows, set things on fire. Then they would co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the leader of the country for all the problems. They would even have the media release false polls to show the popular leader is unpopular, so that when they would do their coup, nobody would fight it. And so when the country got panicky enough and confused enough, they would have a rigged election. They would replace the leader with a Soviet puppet. And so they did this in country after country, Lithuania, Latvia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, so forth. And it's called the Iron Curtain. And Truman does nothing because he thinks the United Nations will bring world peace. But Eisenhower's the next president. And Eisenhower has a choice: do nothing and let these countries fall, or fight fire with fire. And so that's what he does. So Iran sides with the Soviet Union, and they nationalize their oil industry. And you say, big deal. Well, wait a second. Britain has no oil. In 1908, Britain formed the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. You know it better as BP. British Petroleum, BP, is the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. And when Iran nationalizes it and sides with the Soviet Union, Britain has no oil. So they appeal to Eisenhower. Eisenhower approves the first CIA operation to overthrow a country's leader. It's Operation Ajax. And the CIA operative on the ground is Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of Teddy Roosevelt. He goes to Tehran and does the same thing. He recruits mobsters and gangsters and radical imams. They stage protests and riots and attack mosques, and they co-opt the media with bribes and threats to blame the leader of the country. And they cultivate weak links in the military. And when the country gets panicky enough, they have the military traitors go in there and arrest Mossadegh and put him under house arrest, and where he dies. And they install the Shah, who loved America because we put him in. The CIA did the same thing in Guatemala in 1954, Congo 1960, Dominican Republic, Vietnam, Brazil, Chile, and the KGB did the same thing, with Brezhnev helping Yasser Arafat to start the PLO, and Brezhnev hugging Castro and taking over countries in Latin South America and in Cuba. This is called the Cold War. Chris Matthews, in his last talk before he got fired, when there was a debate of Democrat candidates and one talked about socialism, he says, I remember the Cold War. I've seen what socialism is like, and I don't like it, okay? It not only is not free, it doesn't work. I believe if Castro and the Reds had won, there would have been executions in Central Park. He got fired for saying that. Anyway, well, let's talk about Castro. Castro had a killer named Che Guevara. Che Guevara said, we executed many people by firing squad without knowing if they were fully guilty. I'd like to confess, I discovered I really like killing. He said, blind hate against the enemy creates a forceful impulse that cracks the boundaries of natural human limitation, transforming the soldier into an effective, selective, cold killing machine. A people without hate cannot triumph. And anyway, so here you have a group wanting to stir up hate. And then Karl Marx, Frederick Engels wrote the Communist Manifesto, and they also wrote this, that they were alchemists of the revolution. Their business consisted in spurring it into artificial crises. Every new crisis must be more serious and universal than the last. Every fresh slump must ruin more small capitalists. This will increase the number of the unemployed. And in the end, commercial crisis will lead to a social revolution. Here they are literally wanting to put people out of business so that they can have a commercial crisis. And anyway, so I thought this was interesting. 1980s communist defector came to America and basically spilled the beans on what they do. And he says, people think of KGB as James Bond. He goes, no, our job was to identify the public opinion molders and then use them to rot the country from the inside. We couldn't defeat America on two fronts during World War II, so let's rot them from the inside. And he says it's a 20-year period to do this. And he says once you go through it, people are so brainwashed, you can take them to the Soviet Union, show them a concentration camp, they won't believe it. He says next is a 5-year period where you get the country to spend, and bankrupt themselves. He says the next is a 6-month period where you have a crisis, you blow out of proportion, spread panic around the country, and then you do your coup. And but he says that the first stage, he says you identify the public opinion molders and swing them in a socialist direction in the media, education, and the pulpit. And so in 1963, Representative Albert Herlong reads into the congressional record a list of how the communists planned to do it. And one of them was this: infiltrate the churches and replace revealed religion with social religion. So how did it happen? Well, there was a black man named Manning Johnson who became a communist in the 1930s. And after he even ran for Congress in New York as a communist. And then he realized that they really didn't want to benefit his people. They just wanted to stir them up and use them to bring division. And so he left them, and he wrote a book called Color, Communism, and Common Sense. And he wrote a book, this book here. And Archibald Roosevelt, the son of Teddy Roosevelt, wrote the foreword to it. And he even testified before the U.S. Congress. And he talked about them infiltrating the churches. And he says that they first tried to do what they did in the Soviet Union, get people to spit on the Bible and stomp on the Bible. You know, in Russia, they made them get rid of it. He says the people, the minorities in America, were still too tied to the Bible. So they couldn't get them to get rid of it. But he says, so we decided to change the gospel. He says the new line went like this: Jesus, the carpenter, was a worker like the communists. He was against the money changers, the capitalists, the exploiters of the day. This is why he drove them from the temple. Communists are the modern day fighters against capitalists and money changers. If Jesus were living today, he'd be persecuted like the communists. So forget the gospel that we're sinners and our sins condemn us to hell, and Jesus, the only begotten Son of God, died on the cross to pay for all of our sins. Forget that. Jesus was just a Palestinian activist. And Alexander Solzhenitsyn, he had spent 11 years in Gulag prison camps. He said, I call upon America to be more careful with its trust, prevent those from falsely using the struggle for social justice to lead you down a false road. So the last installment in my talk is Rules for Radicals, Saul Alinsky. He rode around with Al Capone's hitmen in Chicago. So how all you had to do was kill a few people, smash a few windows, create this crisis, democracy without morals and virtue ends in crises. And he says people panic and agreed to pay the mob protection money. So he applied it to politics. And he says that the first step of community organizing is community disorganizing. Disruption of the present organization is the first step. The organizer's first job is to create the issues or the problems. The organizer must first rub raw the resentments of the people of the community. An organizer must stir up dissatisfaction and discontent, fan the latent hostilities of many of the people to the point of overt expression. The organizer polarizes the issue, helps lead his forces into conflict. He must search out controversy, for unless there is controversy, the people are not concerned enough to act. And now he puts this acknowledgement in the front of his book. Lest we forget an over-the-shoulder acknowledgement to the first radical known to man who rebelled against the establishment and did it so effectively he at least won his own kingdom, Lucifer. He acknowledges Lucifer. So what's he talking about? It's Proverbs 6. 6 things the Lord hates. Yea, 7 are an abomination. Proud look, lying tongue, hands swift to shedding innocent blood, like Planned Parenthood. And the last is he that soweth discord amongst the brethren. That's the demonic strategy. How do you destroy a marriage? Discord. How do you destroy a church? Discord. How do you destroy a country? Discord. You sow it up. You sow discord. And anyway. And so this is what we've been experiencing in America this last generation or so, this intentional stirring up of discord. And so you see the COVID response. The first thing was to do what? Let criminals out of jail. Who does that? And then crime goes up. Duh. Let criminals out, crime's let up. Didn't see crime goes up. And then some people feel unsafe and they move out of the big cities. Who moves out? Well, maybe those with families. So pro-family people move out. Who's left in the city? Maybe those more people dependent on government entitlements. Well, they usually belong to two different political parties. And then businesses are closed and windows smashed. And so pro-business people move out of the city. They usually belong to a political party. And then churches are shut down where pro-life gather. And then schools are closed and kids indoctrinated with hate America are free to riot. The net result of the COVID response was more people from one political party moved out of the big cities, leaving the other political party in full monopoly control of city politics. If they wanted to do some voter fraud, there sure enough would be fewer poll watchers of the other party. But in a presidential election years, whoever wins the big city wins the state. Whoever wins the state gets all the electoral votes for the state, and the president is elected by electoral votes. So there's a clear political advantage to one party in the COVID response of having violence going up in the cities. Anyway, I go through all the world's history and show the most common form of government is top down. And then America's founders decided to flip it and do a polarity change, and our government's bottom up. It's the difference between a dead pyramid and a living tree, where every root and every little capillary root sucks up nutrients to keep the tree alive. So who's the king in America? Basically, we are. There's all these quotes I have of here's Lincoln, the people of these United States are the rightful masters of both Congresses and courts. So who's the king in America? We are. The word citizen is Greek. It means co-king or co-ruler. Every citizen forms a part of the sovereign power. He possesses a vote, not to votes to abdicate the throne, right? And so imagine, visiting a king in the Old Testament. You're witnessing murder, rape, and crime, and you get into the king's chamber, and the king looks at you and says, I wish somebody would fix this mess. And you reach over, tap him on the shoulder, and say, you're the king. You're the one that's supposed to fix this mess. That's like somebody in America watching TV, seeing all the terrible stuff going on, saying, I wish somebody would fix this mess. Hello, have a finger reach through the screen, tap you on the shoulder. You're the king. You're the one responsible to fix this mess. Well, I need somebody to tell me what to do. Since when does the king sit on his throne and say, can somebody tell me what I'm supposed to do? Hey, butler, come here. What am I supposed to do? No, it's your job to get educated on the issues, seek God's will, and you tell your representatives what needs to happen. You're the king. Anyway, I'll end with this last. The word politics is Greek. It comes from the word polis, which means city, like Annapolis, Indianapolis, metropolis. Polis means city. Politics is the business of the city. And So our founding fathers, for all their faults, they gave you a present. And the present is you get to be in charge of your life, and all of us together get to be in charge of the country. And then we get a voluntary choice to surrender ourselves to Jesus, the King of Kings. And then if the people are the king, who are the counselors to the king? So 379 AD, there's a Christian Roman emperor named Theodosius. He's going to church in Milan, and the pastor is St. Ambrose. Could you imagine being Bishop Ambrose and have the Roman emperor in your church on Sunday? Wow, imagine that. Guess what? That's exactly what we have in America. In America, the people are the king, and the majority of the people are Christian. 1965, we had a large percentage of it, and it's been going down, but still the majority of the people in America are Christian. And so the people are the king, and the majority of the people are Christian. And if you saw the movie The Lord of the Rings, there's a king, and the king has a spell cast on him, and he has two counselors. One is this greasy guy named Wormtongue that's telling the king to stay asleep. Sort of like somebody that tells, a pastor that tells this congregation not to get involved. And there's another counselor to the king named Gandalf. And he casts the devil out of the king, and then the king starts to come awake. And he says, dark have been my dreams of late. And he says, maybe you'll remember your strength if you take your sword. So the pastor's job is to wake up the king. The king is in the pews. You don't just have the right to vote in America, you'll be held accountable to God for what happens. That's why I appreciate your pastor so very, very much. Because he realizes the fact that you, the people, are in charge of America, and he's releasing you and encouraging you to go out there and be the king. Take authority, right? Minister God's will into this lost and dying world. So the most important thing is to bring people to Christ. The second most important thing is to preserve the freedom to do the most important thing. People say, oh, we're so spiritual, we're not going to get involved. It's like, you really don't believe the gospel, do you? If you really believe the gospel, you'd be involved wanting to preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. Because if Sharia law Islam takes over, it's the death penalty to preach the gospel. If communist China is going into Hong Kong right now, and they're limiting them from preaching the gospel. And in Houston, they had the first open lesbian mayor. She wanted to censor all the sermons of all the pastors. They're wanting to limit what you can say about the gospel, what's sin and what's not sin. So in other words, if you're really convinced the gospel is the answer, you will be involved wanting to preserve the freedom to preach the gospel. And all those people that are so super spiritual, oh, we're just being involved, we're just going to preach the gospel. You really don't believe the gospel. You're just putting on a show. Anyway, in crisis, people turn to Christ, and in times of crisis, God raises up leaders. We're facing crises, and historically, it's the crises that God raises up leaders. And anyway, I've shared it before, but in closing, someday you'll be dead. That's a nice way to end a talk. And you'll be in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. And when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining as the sun, with no less days to sing his praise, the one we just begun. Imagine you've been in heaven 10,000 years. And you're walking the streets of gold, and you meet Moses. And maybe Moses will invite you over to his place. Jesus said, in my Father's house there are many mansions. I don't know what it's like, but I bet Moses will have a pretty nice place. He'll probably have one of those big fireplaces where the logs don't burn up. Get it? The burning bush in the wilderness didn't burn up, then the logs. I heard one preacher say, in heaven, you'll travel as fast as you think, and I'll probably show up late. My wife will say, where were you? I say, I was thinking about something else. I don't know. But imagine being there in Moses' living room. Maybe he has a big living room like here. And after all the small talk's over, he's sitting right in front of you. You reach over, tap him on the shoulder, say, Moses, tell us the story again. I read the book, I even saw the movie. But here you are in person. The room will get quiet. Moses will stand up and he'll say, I was 80 years old. And Pharaoh, the most powerful military leader in the world, was charging in at us with these chariots and these razor-sharp swords. And we were totally unarmed and it looked hopeless. But I just stood there and held up my staff. And I said, God, use me to deliver your people. And the waves came in and swallowed up Pharaoh's chariots. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to look around the room and see David. Say, David, tell us your story. And the room will get quiet. David will stand up. So I was just a teenager. And this thug Goliath was mocking our God and making fun of our faith. And these grown-ups were too chicken to do anything. And I said, well, enough of that. Took my little sling, went out there and hit him in the head, and took his own sword and chopped his head off. We're going to say, wow. Then we're going to have Gideon tell his story, and Deborah and the Apostle Paul. It's going to be great. Everybody's going to, and then everyone in the room is going to look at you. Say, we haven't heard from you yet. Tell us your story. What was going on earth when it was your turn to be down there? What were they saying about God, or the 10 Commandments, or the baby that the Lord knew in the mother's womb, or marriage that God himself instituted in Genesis? What did you do when the whole world was against you? What did you do when you were backstabbed by some of your Christian friends? What did you do? Did you give up? Did you hang in there? I'd hate for any of us to be up there and Jesus to walk in the room and have a big screen and all kinds of great things happening, miracles and people coming to the Lord, and him saying, this is what I had planned for you to do. But you just didn't have enough faith and courage. And you look back at your life and you see that big mountain that held you back, and it was just a little anthill, this fear of man, what people are going to think about me. And you said, I let that hold me back from doing all that? And you can't go back to earth and do anything else for the Lord because you're already in heaven because you believe that Jesus died on the cross to pay for all your sins. But guess what? We're still on this earth. We still have feet that trod the soil. You still can do those things you'll be known for forever. Out of the thousands of years of world history, God chose for you to be alive right now. He knows all the dirty backroom deals that everybody's doing, and he thinks you've got what it takes. He chose for you to be alive. He's given you his word. He's given you his spirit. He's given you a great church, great pastor. He thinks you can do this. It's like a basketball coach, and you're on the bench, and he slaps you on the back and says, okay, your turn, get in the game. And you're like, but coach, they're playing really tough out there. And I go, yeah, I know. It's your turn, get in the game. You're like, look, coach, somebody just got knocked down. It's like, yeah, you're 7 feet tall. They are 4 feet tall. You can do this. Greater is he that's in you than he that's in the world. Amen. Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's talk. Kind of looks like a lot of what we're going through right now, doesn't it? And the way ahead looks a little bleak. But we can change that. We can go back and turn our attention back to God as the head of our government and the head of our life, instead of going to the government. So it's not as bad as it seems, and I think we'll get there. So have a nice day.